series. We're really excited today to be digging into data policies in Kenya, and we are joined by George Odera, who's going to speak with us in more detail. For today's session, we'll start by hearing from George, who's an actuary at Safaricom, and of course, we'll do a much better introduction than I have done. We'll then pause for Q&A, so an opportunity for any questions you have. Of course, as the session is going, if you have a question, please feel free to drop that question in the chat, and we can pause and answer or raise your hand. And then, we'll allow, George to answer or to hear from others who are with us today. As I said before, it is my pleasure to introduce George Odera, who has a background in insurance, and first at Madison Insurance, then at IRA, is also a part-time lecturer at both Strathmore University and University of Nairobi, and now is working with Safaricom as an actuary who's focused on innovation in the insurance space. So, George, I'm sure that you can introduce yourself better. I also know that as a side, you are in the pilot space as well. So many interesting things to learn today. And with George, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Emma, for the introduction. I believe I don't need to do any other further introduction. So you've pretty much summed it. So again, I'm just checking that I'm audible. If not at any point in time, kindly let me know.
Thanks, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, cool. So I'll get started. I reckon we have about 2 hours allocated towards the session. I'll probably take the first half hour going through the deck, cognizant that it's just after 5 p.m. Local time, so most of you might have had a long day in the office. Then I intend it to be an interactive session. We'll have a Q&A. If you have any question at some point in between the presentation, just feel free to ask a question, then we can take it on the fly. So for starters, if we really think deeply about data, there are a few quotes which I'd like to start off with. So first is that the ability to actually take any data set, understand it, process it, extract value from it, visualize and communicate it to an audience is a really important skill in its present form and in the next decades to come. And data in itself is systems which we currently have. So I'll start off with just a deep dive around data. Then we'll have an overview on some of the data protection regulations that exist. So looking at both GDPR in the EU and also closer home in country in Kenya. Then there's a Data Protection Act that has currently been enforced or enacted into law. So we'll just be touching on that as well. Then we look at what is covered within the data protection regulations. There are a number of items which have explicitly been covered. There are some exemptions also on the data privacy. So it's not always that one will be expected to comply with the Data Privacy Act. So there are some exemptions around it. I'll be touching on that. Then just mention some possible impact on data protection regulations. Look at some recent developments. high-profile organizations that have been fined. So we'll be just touching on that. Then lastly, we'll just finish off with a Q&A session or an open discussion, whereby you may want to highlight your own experiences relating to data protection within your organization, that is. So if we look at the volume of data being produced, you are conversant with terabytes as a measure of data. But if we look at on it on a wider scale, the volume of data being produced on a daily basis across different platforms are quite huge. Now, as at 2013, there was about 4.4 zettabytes of data, and I've put a scale up there for you to just, rather there's a scale up there for you to just put that in relation to how many terabytes make up one zettabyte. And increasingly, data is being produced day and day. Now, if you think about it, there are several platforms which are available online. And from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed, you find that you are interacting with at least one, if not most of the platforms. And again, depending on your age, I know there are some people who are not conversant with some of the platforms, myself included. But across the different platforms, you'll find that user data is being captured, stored, and generated by the minute. Now, this is unprecedented, given that all these platforms actually came to be in the last decade or so. So that said, you find that the volume and mass of data, which is actually being produced in recent years, is far much more than what has been produced since the human being came to be in existence. And this is especially so in the digital form. Now, I'll start off with data regulations in the European Union, because that's where the whole general data protection regulations started. So the data privacy in itself started some time back. In 1995, there was a data protection directive, which was adopted. Then 3 years later, it was enforced. The first draft relating to GDPR was done at the beginning of 2012. So that's when the first release was done. It was subsequently debated in the European Parliament, and votes to support it was received in March of 2014. The Council agreed on a general consensus approach mid of 2015. So remember, before Brexit, UK was part of the European Union. And given that different member states had different interests, then there was need to have a general consensus around the implementation on the same. So the actual GDPR was adopted early 2016. Then from May of 2018, it was adopted by all member states. After the UK pulled out of the European Union, you find that it was part of the, rather it was cognizant of the GDPR. So you find that it has still maintained part of what was adopted. And I've included a link at the bottom for your own read after the session if you want to find out more about the GDPR regulations in Europe. Now, if I look at the Kenyan space, so we have a Data Protection Act, which was enacted in November 2019. So about 2 years ago, we are just coming to that. Then a data protection commissioner was appointed 1 year later, so November of last year. Then January of this year, there was a task force that was appointed by the Cabinet Secretary for ICT, and it was mandated to come up with regulations on data protection. Now, there are a few items which that task force is required to work on. So one is a development of the specific data protection regulations. They are also meant to audit the Data Protection Act with the purpose of just identifying any gaps or inconsistencies within the app. Although I must mention that that feels a bit like, again, like a retrospective approach, given that I will have expected that such an engagement will be done as part of public participation when coming up with the first act in the first place. Then that task force is also meant to propose any new policies, be it legal or institutional, which are needed to implement the act. Now, in again January of this year, the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner issued a status report 100 days after they began operations. So there are a couple of things which have been put in place, and they're again available in the Data Protection Commissioner's link. I've put it again at the bottom for you to access in your free time. So the Citizen Service Charter has already been defined. So this charter just outlines what you can expect to receive from the Data Commissioner's Office or Protections Office, for that matter, as a citizen. There is a complaints management manual, which has also been formulated. It's still in draft form under discussion. There is a guidance note on consent, and also a guidance note on data protection impact assessment. Now, there are a couple of draft guidelines which are awaiting public input. So those guidelines basically are on registration of data controllers and data processors. So we'll be looking at that in a minute. So who is a data controller and who is a data processor? Then there's also a certification of data controllers and processors. So for you, of either of the two, you actually need to be registered with the Data Protection Commission. Then there's also appointment of data protection officers who will be tasked with enforcing the Data Protection Act. Then there's also a draft guideline on data sharing code and how it's going to be enforced. So a link again is included there. I last accessed it today. It may change over time, but yeah, that's just something to keep tabs of. Now, it does not mean that the country does not have existing regulation relating to data protection. So we've had various regulations in one form or another. So for instance, we have the Kenya Information and Communications Act, which was enacted in 1998. So there are a couple of regulations under it. There is consumer protection and a registration of SIM card, of which telcos are expected to abide by. Then very key and sensitive is medical regulations. So we have a Public Health Act, which was enacted in 2012. We have a revised act on the same, 2017. Then a HIV, AIDS, and Prevention Control Act, 2006. And I'm sure within your company operations, you must be cognizant of what is contained within this act, especially for healthcare insurance. Then looking at the financial sector regulations, we have a National Payment System Act enacted in 2011. And again, this was mainly driven by innovations within the banking sector and also adoption of M-Pesa countrywide as a payment channel. Then we also have national payment system regulations, which came in, which were enforced in 2014. Lastly, there is a Consumer Protection Act, which defines the rights of a consumer that was enacted in 2012. So you'll find that, yes, we've had some level of data regulations the four specifically, which are currently on the screen, and organizations have complied with these regulations. Now, the Data Protection Act introduces specific regulations which then cover personal information relating to a data subject. Now, if we do a deep dive for a moment on the Data Protection Act, now the key purpose of this act is it aims to control processing of any personal information by a data controller or a data processor. And it applies to controllers or processors registered or resident in Kenya and who process information within the country. It also applies to any data controller or data processor that may not be registered or residing in country, but process any information for data subjects located in Kenya. So what that means is that if it's a foreign company operating or registered abroad, and you can cite examples of such large companies like taxi hailing cabs or social media streaming sites, they are still required act given that they are processing personal information of data subjects located within the country. Now, there are specific things which the act aims to achieve. One is that it has provided a legal framework for the establishment of data protection commissioner, and the commissioner was appointed last year, November. And it's also given effect to Article 31C and D of the Kenyan Constitution in relation to the right of privacy for citizens. Third, it's also looking at how to regulate processing of personally identifiable information. And we'll also be looking at that in a minute on what constitutes personal identifiable information. It also seeks to define the rights of a data subject, as well as also defining the obligations of a data controller or a data processor. So there are three key definitions which I would like to call out. So the first one is a data controller. So this is a company or a person who determines how personal data is processed. So perfect example is a telco like Safaricom, Airtel, etc. It could be your bank, and it could also be your insurance company. Data processor is any company or person who then processes the data on behalf of a controller. So key to note is that a data controller may also be a data processor because they could double up on the same role. Perfect examples there in our market is Oracle. Then we have insurance brokers or insurance agents who act on behalf of the insurance company. Lastly, the data subject is simply any person who can be identified. So it can be a customer for a business. It could be your employee within the firm. It could be a shareholder for the company. Now, the personal identifiable information is defined as any information which you can use to identify a data subject. So maybe it's not a surprise to you on the list. So your name, national ID number, or Huduma number, which is currently being rolled out. Your passport number, email address, telephone number. Then there's also sensitive data, which is maybe not unique to you as a person because it's a shared trait, but it's considered sensitive to you. So things to do with your ethnicity, sexual orientation, any political or religious beliefs, biometrics, or underlying health conditions. So again, it's important to actually make a clear split between personal identifiable information and also what is considered sensitive. Now, while the Data Protection Act has been put in place to safeguard your personal data, and this one I'm talking directly to a data subject, it's the ultimate responsibility of you as a data subject to ensure that you do not necessarily expose your personal information. I know with the social media channels nowadays, it's become a platform of communication. So people post pictures where they are, what they are doing. But again, in so doing, you may be unnecessarily exposing yourself, and your information can actually be used for unintended purposes. So much as the act is there to safeguard your information, you do have the ultimate responsibility to ensure that you do not make any sensitive information publicly available. Now, I'll want us to focus on the scope of data protection regulations. So what does the Data Protection Act and regulations seek to introduce? So the first one is consent of a data subject. Now, a data subject should have the capacity to understand and communicate their consent uh, towards either a data processor or a controller having access to information. So this is very crucial in terms of consent to your data being used. The communication should be done in a clear manner. So any data subject should be able to clearly understand how the information is going to be processed and how it's going to be used. And our consent here has been defined as voluntary and specific. So for instance, if you are coming up with wording relating to how you're going to use customer information, the consent should not be general. So you should not generalize it. You should really be specific, and the customer should be fully aware of the specific personal information which is going to be used and the form in which it's going to be used. Now, there are some rights which have also been defined relating to the data subject. So the first one is the right of access. So as a data subject, you can say that you want a copy of all the data held by a data processor or a data controller. And you can also specify that you need to understand what they want to do with your data. So that's on the right of access. Right of portability, you can say that I want to move my data to another company. So perfect example, if it's a pension scheme or insurance company, you are changing insurance providers, you can actually request them to move your data from one company to another. Right of correction, so you have a right as a data subject to request for a correction or update to be done to your data. So it could be because one, the data is outdated, or two, it's inaccurate, or three, it's incomplete. So you can update any of the details currently held by a data processor or
Hey, George.
Hello, sorry. My network dropped for a minute. I hope I'm audible. I'm not sure where I lost you when I was speaking.
No worries at all. We can hear you now. Um,
Okay, sorry about that.
no worries.
Yeah, so I think I was mentioning around a correction. I believe
Mm-hmm.
that's where.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
right.
Okay. Cool. So on Erasure, you can ask for your data to be deleted. So this could be either it's credible in rather it's accurate data which you want to be deleted, or two, it could be any false or misleading data or information. So you can request it to be deleted. Uh, then in terms of information, you can explicitly request to be informed on the use of your data. So companies may be tasked to actually specify how they intend to use the personal data that has been collected. Then there's also the right to objection. So you can request for your data to be the company to cease using any data for a specific purpose. It could be for marketing, it could be for pricing, etc. Then also in terms of automated decisions, you can request for the logic behind any analytics models that have been used. And this specifically applies to automated pricing models where there is some code in the backend that does some calculations and says based on your specific personal information or rating factors, you need to pay a certain price for a specific financial product. So you can actually, as a data subject, request for the logic behind the calculations. So if you think about it, these are really new uh, items or rights which are being introduced by the Act. And in the subsequent section of the slide, we'll be looking at the impact of what some of these rights are going to introduce within the company operations. The third scope on the data protection is collection of personal data. Now, it has defined collection of personal data in various forms. So it can be on a one-on-one basis with a data subject. It can be through any publications. It can be through CCTV recordings. It can be through biometrics, or for instance, even cookies, which you consent to enhance your browsing experience on websites. Now, what is required of data controllers and processors is one, there is a principle called data minimization. So they are permitted to only collect what is necessary and permitted by law. Now, an obvious implication for that is, and again, if I look at it in the insurance sense, any information which you collect should be used for a specific purpose. So there is no blanket collection of information just for purposes of building, say, a database with which you would want to use to do any repricing or market segmentation. Going forward, you should only collect what is necessary and permitted. Secondly, is that there is need to ensure that any data which is collected is accurate. So you'll need to apply some sense checks as a data controller or a data processor to ensure accuracy of the data which has been obtained. Then securing data after collection is also key. Now, if you look at how pricing has been done in the past or valuations, you'll find that policy specific information has been shared, which you can use to easily identify a particular customer. Going forward, you'll be required to apply an encryption to a specific data set. So for instance, if it's a mobile number, you may need to just apply a unique identifier. If it's a national ID number, you may again need to encrypt and apply a unique identifier. But the primary or raw value of that personal information should not be shared by any third party in any way. Then lastly, relating to collection of data, only sensitive personal data should be collected from the data subject. So remember, I had explained earlier on the difference between personally identifiable information and also what is considered as a sensitive data. So the requirement is that for any sensitive data, you collect it directly from the data subject. The fourth scope of the regulations look at the commercial use of personal data. So you'll find that data controllers or processors will collect any personal information with the intention of making some commercial use out of the data. Now, what is permitted under the regulations is one, you should not use any sensitive personal information. So that has been explicitly called out. Two is that any data subject has to be notified on the commercial use of the information. So it's not just enough to tell a data subject or a customer in that sense that you're going to collect ABCD. You need to actually specify how you intend to use it commercially, whether it's for pricing, otherwise, and they need to consent to the same. So explicit consent has to be given by the customer or data subject. Then they need to be provided with an opt-out mechanism. So what that means is that today they may have given consent for you to use their information. Tomorrow they want to opt out of it. Now you should provide a clear mechanism for them to opt out of it, and after which any of that information will then be subject to the right of erasure. Lastly is any personal data has to be collected from the data subject. So the key emphasis here is that any information which you wish to collect from any personal information which you need to collect rather needs to come from the data subject. I know right now there's a lot of information which is being shared via APIs, application programming interfaces, across different companies. So for instance, an insurance company may be consuming data from NTSA or from the government registry. So we will need to rethink how such information is going to be shared going forward, given that the data subject has to explicitly consent to such information being shared. Whether it may mean that if they don't consent, they are not eligible for a product, I think that's another discussion. But again, there are also regulations around the discrimination of data subjects. So you'll need to strike a balance between the two, especially on product access. The fifth scope is on obligations of a data controller or a data processor. First, there is limitation on retention of personal data. So they've specified a duration within which you can hold data relating to a data subject, after which the data is to be erased. I've already talked about masking of any personal data. You need to use a pseudo to mask the data set which is personally identifiable before you share it out. So whether it's data which is shared with actuaries, for instance, for pricing, valuation, shared with your marketers to segment customers, you need to mask any personal information. Third is data protection policy. So data controllers and processors will need to implement and adopt a data protection policy within the organization. In the event that the data processor and data controller are not the same, then there needs to be a well-defined agreement between the two as to how information is going to be shared. And also there's an explicit obligation relating to sharing of personal information and any automated decision-making tools which may be used. The sixth obligation is around a concept called protection by design or by default. So this needs to be embedded very at the start of the product design process. So it's not an afterthought. So you don't design a product, then now come and work retrospectively on data protection. Rather, data protection need to be embedded from the beginning of the product design process. And it's not just specific to insurance or financial services space. It cuts across the other industries as well. So key components on what is required, and the sixth scope is lawful processing of data. So you should only process any data in a lawful manner. Then transparency is also required within the process. Any data should be specifically obtained for the purpose of the assignment. So I've mentioned there's no, it's you are not permitted to just collect ad hoc data for the purpose of storing it and making any subsequent analysis in any form. Then integrity and confidentiality of the data. Data minimization, which speaks to the limitation of the personal data. Accuracy and also storage limitation. There's a defined period which you'll need to configure where any personal data may need to be erased after the time period has elapsed. The seventh scope of the regulations are around notification for any breaches relating to the data. Now, a data breach is defined as any incident which may result in the harm of a data subject if that breach relates to identifiable personal information. So things to do, say, with your full name, identification number or Huduma number, passport number, etc. Account information. So across the different social sites, so your Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. And also any password or security codes relating to the websites which you visit. And again, you will find that there are some data controllers who will be more hardest hit in the event of a breach because they cut across different jurisdictions. So for instance, if you're looking at a company like Google, Facebook, they operate around the world, and you find that in the event of any data breach, it's likely to impact customers across different jurisdictions. Now, the data breach excludes any information which is publicly available or which has been disclosed by law. So if there is an explicit requirement by law for you to disclose any personal data and it's available within the public domain, then any data breach excludes any such information. Now, there's a requirement that the data commissioner must be notified in the event that there is any personal data breach. There are penalties of 1% of your prior year annual turnover, and this is per incident. So if you have 10 incidents in a year, it's technically going to be 10%. If you have 100 incidents within the year, you'll simply be paying an equivalent of your annual turnover. And it's also capped at 5 million. So it's either 1% of the annual turnover or 5 million shillings. Now, if we look at the eighth scope relating to transfer of data outside Kenya. Now, remember I mentioned that you may be a data processor or a data controller company operating outside of Kenya. but you're processing data relating to data subjects residing within the country. Now, there are some requirements that you'll need to meet prior to transfer. First is that there need to be well-defined, legally enforceable obligations for you as a data processor or company residing outside the country. Two is that there'll need to be consent to transfer data from the data subject. So you'll need to explicitly notify the data subjects that I've collected your information within the country, but will be transferring the data outside of the country. So they need to give an explicit consent on the same. There are some cross-border transfer agreements which also need to be put in place and enforced. So what the Data Protection Commissioner defines as a cross-border agreement is any country or territory which has a reciprocate or appropriate data protection regulation. So one, it's either ratified by the AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, or two, if it has reciprocal data protection agreements within Kenya, and thirdly is if it has an adequate data protection law determined by the data commissioner. So there could be instances where the data commissioner is going to establish the principle of equivalence as far as cross-border transfer regulations are concerned on a case-by-case basis across different regulations. Now, within the East African bloc, I know there are also talks to harmonize different financial services products and services within East Africa, and I know to a wide extent within Africa. So there could be wider consultative meetings and engagements going forward as different countries also establish regulations relating to data protection. Just in the same vein, the way the GDPR has been harmonized across different EU member states, within the African Union, you'll find that the data protection is going to be harmonized across. So it means that if a data controller or data processor is resident in Kenya, there could be some specific regulations which apply in country, but other regulations could apply to data processors located in any country within the continent. Now, there are certain exemptions on compliance with the data protection regulation. So it's not all instances whereby the Data Protection Act and regulations are going to take precedence. There are some exemptions to it. First is in the event that any disclosure is in the interest of national security or public interest. So that exemption could apply in such an instance. Two is if it's required by law or a court order to disclose any information which could then be used to determine the outcome of a particular case. So there could be an exemption in that instance. Three is if such information is required for crime prevention and detection. So remember I mentioned that one of the forms which information can be collected, and that's personal information, are CCTV cameras. Now, I know within the country, there have been installations in major towns just for purposes of curbing crime. So as a data subject, your information cannot be used, say, to disclose where you are at a particular point in time because for privacy reasons. However, if, say, you've been involved in a crime, then records can be made to such recordings for purposes of establishing or detecting or preventing any crime. Fourth exemption is if it's required for prosecution of an offender. So as a data controller or a data processor, you may be called upon to disclose some information required to prosecute an offender. Now, you'll find that some data controllers or processors have already set some very stringent regulations as part of their core business operations. Sometimes back, you'll recall that there was an outcry when Apple declined to disclose information, personal information, which were used by terrorists to commit a crime because it was against their data privacy laws. So you'll find that there could be instances where you as a data processor may be called upon to disclose certain information. But again, the backdrop of that is going to be against your own regulations relating to what information you disclose on a data subject. Fifth is on tax compliance. So you'll find that certain personal information, for instance, your KRA PIN number, your ID number, or your company VAT number, may be required to establish compliance relating to tax. So that's also an exemption which has been specified by the Data Commission. So any of your information may be shared for purposes of establishing whether you are tax compliant. I know banks have been introducing a KRA PIN requirement on opening of new accounts, and they've also been applying it retrospectively. My guess is, and these are just my views, perhaps we may get to a level where KRA may be auditing your bank account transaction details to try and tally with the tax returns which you currently file, just for them to establish whether you've not disclosed any additional sources of income. Lastly is any permitted health situations. Now, as part of the mandate for the task force, which was established by the Minister for ICT early this year, part of their mandate was to review and recommend on what personal information was to be shared to manage COVID-19 within the country. So you'll find that in instances where there is an epidemic, a pandemic, or a disease outbreak, then your personal information may actually be used by the health authorities without your consent, purely for the purpose of managing the public interest or putting the healthcare interest of the public and the country at large in their best interest. Now, the sixth item on the agenda item, which I'll want us to look at, is the impact on some of the regulations. So for starters, legal and compliance. So of course, the Data Act is a legal tool which has been used to enforce the data regulations. So that's definitely going to affect how businesses operate. We've seen new roles being advertised for data privacy and data protection officers within companies. And especially this is the case for companies which process a lot of customer information. Product terms and conditions may need to be rewarded to ensure that they are compliant. So this is something which is easy to do for new customers signing up to terms and conditions, but you will also need to reward existing policies or terms and conditions retrospectively. And again, customers will need to consent to those new terms and conditions. In instances where they do not consent to them, then any data processor, data controller, or company may need to have give the customer a mechanism to actually opt out of the product. And again, this is particularly crucial for long-term contracts within the financial services, insurance and pensions specifically. System and business processes will need to be audited. So risk and compliance departments for companies will need to set up processes as to how they're going to audit the different business lines to ensure that they're actually in compliance with the data protection regulations. Then, like we've seen, there are heavy and hefty fines for failing to comply. And of course, there's also reputational damage that comes as well with any publicized case. The second potential impact on the regulations are on data. So one is that companies will need to redefine their data management processes. I know most companies have policies in place, but this will need to be relooked at in light of the Act and regulations. Additional configurations will be required for the data subject. So for instance, rights of erasure, how do you set that within your systems? How do you communicate or establish mechanisms where such communication is done by a data subject? Then also, how are you going to give them comfort that their data has actually been erased? So is there a way that they can actually verify that that's the case? Like I mentioned, there's a lot of integration with third-party vendors. The experience quite seamless for customers, but we need to take a step back and look at how we are going to do any integrations with third-party vendors going forward, given that customers have to explicitly consent to sharing of any personal information. The third potential impact is on the product life cycle. So this is, from the product design process to the sell, underwriting claims, if you're looking at insurance, and risk management for non-insurance products. So collection of data for pricing, that's going to change. So a rethink on that is required. How products are going to be marketed, both using the traditional means, so for insurance, basically agents, brokers, bank assurers, and in most recent time through digital platforms. So how is customer information going to be collected for purposes of marketing? It may not be possible to use personal information to segment your customers. They'll need to explicitly consent to it during the product sign-up process. And remember, the regulations have also specified that customers need to be given the option to opt in and opt out. For insurance products, underwriting and claims management, that will also change, specifically balancing the amount of information collected. Now, previously, especially for underwriting forms, a wide range of information will be collected just for purposes of making an underwriting decision. So again, we need to strike a balance on the principle of data minimization to ensure that you can demonstrate that what you are collecting will actually be used for a particular purpose, if it's pricing or valuation. And the customer will also need to explicitly consent to their data being used on the same. Lastly, on the product life cycle is ongoing risk management to demonstrate that the product is in compliance with the data protection. There's going to be a cost which is going to be borne either by the shareholders or by the customers, at least in the short term. Over the long term, it's expected that any costs we are borne to set up and be in compliance, the data protection regulations won't be recurrent for future products. In terms of IT systems, This is probably one business line which will have the largest impact. So you'll find that you may need to reconfigure any current IT systems to ensure that they are in compliance with the Data Act. There'll be need to design an management process to flag down any breach in data privacy, and also to ensure that any notifications are sent in a timely manner to the data commissioner. So you're actually required as a data processor or company to notify the data commissioner promptly on any data breach. Third is that there'll be some significant investment in data encryption or masking tools to safeguard personal information. So you'll find that some systems may not have that capability to mask data. So you may need to acquire third-party turnkey systems which can integrate with your existing established or legacy systems and mask any information. Then lastly, on the IT systems is that, again, there'll need to be a build to require data subjects to explicitly give consent required, say when installing any apps. And I believe from the App Store, Apple Store, or Play Store, you find that in recent days, when you install an app or post installation of an app, it asks you to give certain rights for the app to use your information. So again, that's something which is going to be quite critical as companies digitize and automate business processes. Lastly, for customers, uh, there'll of course be a need to have an awareness drive to both existing customers and new customers to sensitize them on their rights as a data subject. So the company will have that obligation to do in terms of sensitization of their customers. Then, as far as consumption of digital products are concerned, you'll need to ensure that you are in compliance with the data regulations from opt-in, buy process, marketing, all the way to the opt-out process. So that need to be embedded within the product end to end. So last item before I open up the floor to any discussion or comments, I'm just looking at some recent developments globally and also locally. So Vodacom Spain was fined 7 million pounds for repeated data breaches relating to the GDPR regulations, and it was actually warned. It received rather a couple of warnings between 2018 and 2020. Facebook was also fined for breaking EU data privacy law. So you will recall some time back, the Facebook founders were actually summoned by Congress to actually respond to some of the allegations relating to data privacy. Google was also fined 57 million under Europe's data privacy law. And locally, I know there have been some drive to have Safaricom fix privacy issues. So for instance, and some of these functionalities are actually meant to enhance the product's process, but you find that it inadvertently exposes some personal identifiable information. So perfect example, there is an identity check within M-Pesa. When you're sending information, you can punch in a number, then you can see the full names of the intended recipient. So going forward, that will be revised. So for instance, you may not see the full name. You may only be able to see a masked name. So for instance, you'll see the first and last initials for each of the names that the customer has. And there are also quite a number of examples within the telco space where privacy issues will need to be fixed. So if I look across the other financial services space, banks have also been in compliant of the same. So for instance, if you do online transactions, you find that banks normally provide masked identity for recipients of money transfers. So increasingly, you are likely to see more stringent regulations going forward, widely publicized fines, especially for large multinational companies. And of course, with that also comes the reputational damage attached to it, and also additional scrutiny from the Data Commissioner's Office. So I think that brings us to 5 minutes past the hour. I'll want to open up the floor to any questions or discussions.
Feel free to raise your hands, and we can give some. Can give you an option to ask a question.
Yeah, Collins, you're a little bit soft. Do you mind speaking up?
Oh, sorry, I was saying you feel free to lift your hands. Then we can ask a question, or you can just unmute yourself and ask. I'll ask all the questions on your behalf and get all the knowledge.
Yeah,
I find this an interesting
they can chat.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting conversation that a lot of us rarely have. So probably I would ask from George's experience, how would you like implement, let's say, an opt-out policy for a platform or a solution that collects personal identifiable information? Could you provide some guidance around that, or some insight?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just probably respond to that based on my own experience, what we've done internally within Safaricom. So you'll find that for most products which have been availed on the USSD or on app, the customer is required to explicitly opt in to the product. So before you actually have access to the product, you'll be given a link where it has defined the terms specific to the product and also what information is shared. Now, what will change going forward is that given that very few people actually go through the terms and conditions, because the customer is required to explicitly consent to their personal information being shared, it's going to be broken down into two. So before you access any digital product, you'll be required to, one, consent to the terms and conditions. Then two is to consent to sharing of specific information, which will be well outlined. So there's going to be a two-step process that the customer need to consent to before they are actually able to view the different product options. And it could also relate to, say, a digital platform if that were the case. Now, for the opt-out process, again, there is an explicit option provided to customers to opt out of a financial product. Now, they're going to be notified during the opt-out process on their rights on opt-out. So one, whether they want the company to retain their personal information because perhaps you want to opt out temporarily and opt back in at a later date. And this could be the case, say, for lending products where opt-in is required explicitly. Two is that at opt-out, you can also be given the option to select whether you want your data to be erased. So what that means is that if you are to opt in back to the product at a later date, then again, you'll need to explicitly give a fresh consent to your information.
Good. That's interesting. I've actually experienced that scenario while implementing a USSD platform, where you literally have to look at how you do your wordings that you introduce the user to. So just as you'd said earlier, it really needs to be clear and concise, so that the data subject knows that that is the kind of data that they're going to share with you, and they do have an option to opt out. Interesting. Thanks. Any question?
So yeah, I have a question, Collins and George. So I'm one of these skeptics a little bit around the function of privacy, in the sense that more often than not, if you don't really have a choice as a user, right? Because there's essentially like the provider can decide to deny me the service if I don't opt in, as an example. And a good example is what you gave us in terms of Safaricom and the M-Pesa details. George, from your perspective, is this purely just an illusion of control that is being given to the users, when the truth of the matter is that users don't really have a choice? And if I'm a startup developer today, I'm going to do it to check the boxes, but is that taking away from the spirit of what the privacy laws are supposed to do?
Okay, thanks. So as a data subject, you'll find that there's bound to be a thin line between you not consenting to your information being used and the company still being willing to give you a financial service or a financial product. Now, I will say that perhaps the gray area will be in how you actually position how you intend to use that information. Because if you think about it, any personal information should purely be used for product administration purposes. If you are to say get hold of any specific data for pricing, then you may need to make it quite clear to the customer that any of the data which you collect, so say specific to their age or gender, will be used on a global basis. So not really singling out a customer as a single unique person, but sort of aggregating the data and using it to price and offer bespoke products. So I'll say one is that perhaps key is how you actually do communicate it. Then to answer your question specifically, is that you find that as part of the how products are set up, it's unlikely that if you do not consent, say, to the terms of the data privacy being requested by the provider, that you'll be given access to the product. So remember, the data controller or data processor is also, I'll probably use the term boxed, in the sense that he needs to ensure that he has your consent, explicit consent, to use that data. And if you don't give that consent, then pretty much they may not be able to proceed. So I will say a way around that is to just make it try and make it very clear during the opt-in process that the customer fully understands. If they do not consent to it, perhaps it may be worthwhile to follow up with a call, or if the customer is purchasing the product within the social media, engage the customer on social media, ask them why they dropped out. And part of that information which you use can actually be used to refine how you actually position your information.
Yeah, interesting. I think I have a segue to that, George. From a perspective of a scenario where you have several products that touch different customer bases, different industries, and different scenarios of protecting and disseminating data. How do you guys approach such a challenge from a policy perspective, and how do you kind of implement the same just to make sure that the products are in compliant with data privacy policies that exist or affect them?
Okay, thanks. So you may find that in instances where, say, the data processor and data controller is the same. So in the instance of a telco, you'll find that yes, you are required to collect some customer personal information as part of the product onboarding process. Now, when it comes to using that information to do any pricing or marketing, etc., one is that that information is aggregated, and I'm also looking at it in the sense that if any third party was to use any customer information for any pricing, so say they have a strategic partnership with a telco or any other provider, then it may make sense to actually avail a global data relating to that portfolio, but not specific to a particular customer. So, and I mentioned the example of using variables like age, gender, location. The customer may provide that information at an individual level, but if you put it on a global level, anyone who has access to that data may not really pinpoint it to a particular customer. So I believe in that sense, then there won't be any breach relating to using customer personal specific information to price. That notwithstanding, since you are basically aggregating all these data sets, what you'll potentially need to do is that when the customer will actually be providing this information, you'll need to explicitly tell them that the information may be aggregated in the global sense for purposes of offering products, or may be shared with third-party partners for purposes of pricing data.
Okay, thank you. That's quite comprehensive, and I like how you guys have approached it. So yeah, let me open this to the rest of the guys. Please ask your questions. You can even type them on chat.
Okay, Collins, maybe as people type in their questions, I can ask a last one.
Sure.
So George, given the audience that we have here, who are insurtech startups, and a number of them have partnerships with underwriters, where does the burden of responsibility lie in such circumstances, right? Does it lie with the underwriter, or does it lie with the insurtech, who may be providing a new customer acquisition model, for example, but the ultimate customer belongs to the underwriter? What's your take in terms of where the responsibility lies there, and what should the audience look out for, lest they find themselves in a bit of trouble or spot of trouble unknowingly?
Okay, thanks. I think the key thing to understand and to ask yourself as an insurtech or an insurer is what role are you providing within that particular arrangement or products. So you'll find that there are some insurtechs who will play the role of a data controller, and the insurance company is a data processor. And you'll find that some insurtechs will play the reverse role. So they may be a data processor, the insurance company is a data controller. And again, for some, they may actually play the double, where the double hat of both a data processor or a data controller. Now, ultimately, the data controller has, I would say, the absolute mandate in terms of ensuring compliance with the data privacy laws. That notwithstanding, the obligations of the data processor have also been defined. And maybe just to move away from insurtechs and fintechs or insurance companies, I'll just use an example where all of us can relate to. So whenever you enter buildings, I think, and specifically public buildings, it's nowadays the norm to leave your identification card or passport or driving license. You faithfully, put in your personal information without any second thoughts, your name, your telephone number, ID number, email address, for some, in certain instances, even the company where you're coming from. Now, the guy who is actually recording that information acts the role of a data processor, but now the security company in charge is the data controller, because they've outsourced that role to the guy filling in your details. Now, in the event there is any data breach, then ultimately the responsibility is going to lie squarely with the data controller. So, and that's the security company in charge of the building, much as that breach may have been result of the data processor. Now, coming back to InsurTechs, you find that it's an ecosystem within the financial services space where you're trying to build a relation between a company doing the tech bit and sort of the underwriter doing the traditional underwriting and risk management bit. So if there is any information which is being collected by the InsurTech on behalf of the insurance company, then you'll find that the responsibility may lie squarely with the insurance company, but to some extent, the InsurTech or FinTech also has an obligation in terms of any data breaches. So I hope that has sort of put it into perspective. At times it may not really be clear cut, but you'll find, especially where there is a strategic partnership or relationship between an InsurTech and a primary underwriter for purposes of offering a financial product, both may be found liable depending on whose jurisdiction the data breach actually occurred.
Okay. I actually just to as a segue to that, and please ask your questions. I've experienced this scenario several times here in Nairobi, and I feel more comfortable getting into buildings that don't write my name and details down, but use a system to actually collect that information. I know it's easier to implement the policies using some technical configurations and stuff like that. Makes it a little bit easier for me. Yeah, Motishua, you can ask a question.
Thanks, George, for that presentation. So mine is both a question and a comment. One is, like, all this sounds very good, of course, but the reality on the ground is usually, for the bottom of the pyramid sort of people, there's always a challenge when it comes to communicating, what all this represents, right? You can use the most, let me say, the most appropriate language, whether it's even Swahili or English, but then at the end of the day, when you're asking my grandma in the village who's over 75 years old, to consent to data being shared between multiple intermediaries, at the end of the day, she wants to get access to a product or a service. And we did an A and B test where essentially we mapped the two, and what we found is most people cared about the end product or the end service that they were looking for, as opposed to the data. Even for the guys who opted in and actually say that they've consented to, we are GDPR compliant and all that, but then none of them actually read the document itself. So my question is, when it comes to sort of like the people at the bottom of the pyramid who might not be very interested in all that, what you're saying in terms of the data privacy, how do you ensure that the education is there in terms of the clients that you have, as well as just trying to protect their interests as well? Because remember, as an InsurTech, you might have very little insights into who the intermediaries, when it comes to the underwriter, get to access that particular information. You collect the information, share the information, but then at the end of the day, you can only control what you have at that particular point where you're collecting the data. So I don't know whether you can give some insights into that.
Yeah, thanks. So just two quick thoughts on that. One is that as part of consumption of financial products, I think key to it is also just building awareness. So consumer literacy is also quite key. So it goes hand in hand with building of digital products and services. I think, like you've rightly said, most consumers are normally more concerned with the tail end of the service. So if you tell them that, you need to consent to ABC in order to consume the product, you'll find that, they'll consent knowing very well that they stand a chance to actually consume the product. So it's the need which sort of takes precedence to the requirement to give that consent. And I'll probably not even go all the way down to your grandma in the village, age 75. You find that even people who are learned working within the financial services space, whenever you apply for a credit facility with a bank, most guys don't actually even go through the terms and conditions. They are quick to append the signature because they've been told that, yes, they qualify for a credit facility. So I think to a large extent, financial literacy is key. It could be driven also by the Data Protection Commissioner's Office, given that part of their mandate is to also sensitize the public around their rights regarding to data privacy and protection. But like I mentioned, I believe we can also overcome part of that challenge in how we actually communicate to the customer during the product opt-in process. And you may need to think radically through this. So it could be an animated video that is included as part of the opt-in process, just to ensure at least someone understands. You may not have control as to whether by the time they're clicking that they've consented, whether they're doing it out of understanding or whether they're doing it out of anticipation of the financial service product. But it's a phased approach which will need to be done. There are learnings along the way. So I may not really give an absolute answer which will work on day one, but I would say it's something which as an insurtech or fintech or an insurance company looking at offering digital products is something which you'll need to do as part of your product design process.
Absolutely, that is a very good question, and actually it kind of highlights the incremental consent concept. So ideally, just in a nutshell, incremental consent means that you provide notification to the user that you're going to collect this type of data and these are what you want to use. So you don't want to provide an overload of information that will make it hard for them to understand why you're collecting that data. So incremental consent helps you to achieve that. And also over and above that, I think for me, the most important thing is to understand that all of us who are building these technology platforms, we become data stewards. So we have to take that hat and remember that at the end of the day, we're providing these services to a human being who has wants and needs and reservations. And as long as we communicate that clearly, it becomes very, very easy to provide value in a frictionless scenario. Yeah, any question?
And I'll just probably add a few thoughts to that. So
sure.
The beauty of building the incremental consent is that rather than lumping all consent into one, such that it's a take or leave scenario. If you don't consent to everything, I'm not giving you this. It could be in a phased manner whereby provided a customer has consented to ABC, then they can become eligible for this functionality within the product. If they consent ED, then they could also be eligible for this particular functionality. So the product design can actually be tiered and built in that manner whereby certain services are offered based on different levels of consent. So for instance, if you feel that as part of, and I'll give a perfect example on this, telematics. If you feel that for you to offer a usage-based insurance where a customer pays premium based on usage of the vehicle, it can be on a per day basis or a per trip basis, or similar to how Uber operates, then the customer may actually need to consent that they need to share real-time information. So provided they've consented to that, then you may give them that usage-based insurance. Now, at the point of the opt-in process for the motor policy, if they don't consent to that, then the product may revert to the standard insurance cover, where it's either comprehensive or third party running for the full 1 year benefit. So you may actually tire your product designed to follow the same fashion as the tired consent.
Great, and you see how powerful that becomes, especially when you're providing different type of value to the same customer. This can help you price your product accordingly based on the risks you're taking by collecting specific types of data. So incremental consent is a very, very powerful concept that we should all be aware of. Yeah. Anybody else who has a question?
Yeah,
Paul?
perhaps just to add to the conversation. Sorry, Paul,
Sure,
go ahead
sure.
first. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, for me, I'm trying to ask about the publicly available data. So, in other words, called open source intelligence. So, what about that data? Is there the consent aspect also to it?
Okay, thanks, Paul. So you'll find that any publicly available information is normally on a global basis. So if you look at, say, information published by the Kenya Bureau of Statistics, Association of Kenya Insurers, IRA, RBA, etc., it's normally sort of global industry data. It's very unlikely that you'll find information available at customer level, which is available within the public domain, not unless it has been explicitly disclosed and it's required by law. So you'll find that even for government institutions who aggregate data, it's normally at a global basis. And even a perfect example for that is how the census is normally conducted. Yes, they get your personal information. They can pinpoint to you, Paul, as an individual, but whenever they make that information public, it's at a global level, which say can be used for pricing on a global scale.
What about the data in social media? Social media like now LinkedIn, anyone can go on my LinkedIn profile and get maybe my email, my full name, and all other data that actually almost all of the data that you may require to know about me. So what about that data? Some people can actually leverage the same data into marketing and yeah. What about
Yeah,
that?
thanks. So you'll recall part of my sentiments within the presentation was that you have the ultimate responsibility as a data subject in safeguarding your personally identifiable information. Now, much as there are data regulations to protect you, some platforms may give you the option to put your telephone number or email number for purposes of, say, a recruiter contacting you or you making that information available publicly if anyone wanted to reach to you. Now, in terms of a user within the platform getting that information for marketing purposes, if it's a platform like LinkedIn or any other platform, Facebook, etc., they'll ideally need to put in a mechanism whereby if you feel that someone has used the information to, say, do a marketing pitch which was against your consent, then you can actually report that. So you'll find that that needs to be put in place going forward if they've not put that in place already. But again, like I've mentioned, just avoid disclosing any information within the public domain which you feel is personal. You'll find that even across all these social network sites, because as human beings we are social, and you'll find that that's why these social sites have made quite great strides in terms of getting lots of customers. There are many other channels to actually communicate even within the social media sites other than providing your personal details. So I'll say that may be a primary mode. these sites may need to actually sensitize customers around the same, but also, like I mentioned, just provide like a mechanism where if you feel you've been contacted without your consent, then yeah, you can make a report or an incident on the same.
Absolutely. And I've just pushed out a poll to ask guys if you've ever heard of the principles of least privileges. I think just touching on what that is would really help guys. Yeah, I think yeah, 60% of our respondents don't know what that is.
So perhaps you may want to just make a brief on that.
Yeah. So basically what the principles of least privileges means is when you're implementing your solution, you have to make sure that you're giving the least privilege, privilege to whoever is accessing the platform or information, so that you protect any information or rather unnecessary information from leaking. So for example, when you sign up or you try to access a Facebook profile without signing in, it will give you some very basic information and then tell you if you need more information, you have to sign in or sign up. And the process of signing in or signing up, you consent to an organization's privacy policy. So that is how you can implement that scenario, and just making sure that your privacy policies captures the basic protection that you need to implement for data, and then you make sure that also from a data access permissions perspective, you implement a principles of least privilege. So I only access data that I need to access, not data that I want to access. If there's data that I want to access, then there is a different process where you can implement now the principles, incremental consent or acceptance to another additional policy that applies to that specific type of data that you're collecting. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for that. I had a commentary around digital platforms, because I know that's something which I know internally within Safari, and also just specific to insurance. We are currently trying to implement a digital insurance platform, which is going to power different vendors within the ecosystem, and it's various integrated solutions. So whether you're looking at customer management, where customers can be onboarded on a central channel, then provided customers have consented to the information being shared, they can seamlessly consume products within providers who have subscribed to the channel without necessarily having to repeatedly provide the same information over and over again. And it contains a whole lot of different things. So payment solutions are plugged in. If a customer requires insurance premium financing, it's all done digitally within seconds. If a customer wishes to take a policy loan or a credit facility with an underwriter, they can be enabled through the same channel. If you need to manage your vendors, car valuers, where customers say can request for a vehicle valuation digitally, the platform is going to have those capabilities. So I think also key for us is to just take a step back and see how best we can actually position fintechs and insurtechs, and also traditional insurance companies who may have legacy systems, because the cost of actually overhauling an ICT infrastructure is quite expensive. But those legacy systems may be able to communicate directly with the platform via API. So I think in light of data protection and privacy is to see how we can sensitize the customer and also just give them a seamless product experience within the digital platform. So I think in the few months to come, that's something which we'll begin having conversations with the different players within this call.
Absolutely. I think, as they say, it's a thin line between security and usability. So, or user experience. That is something that we really need to keep tabs on, because at the end of the day, if you provide too much security, you might end up losing customers. If you provide very little security, then the customer experience might be very, very bad. Yeah, I think we can take one last question before we wrap up. Anyone? Going once. Going twice. Okay, I think it's a wrap. Thank you, George, so much. This is very helpful, at least for me. I hope it's the same for you guys. Motisho, you want to say something?
Well, just a question, since we are talking about data privacy.
Yeah,
Did George share his contacts, or will that be a breach?
George, is that a breach?
I think that's a good way to actually end the the session. Yeah, but I think I'll include it on the slides, which should be circulated. So in case you need to reach out to me, you can contact me via email. So I'll include my email in the slide.
And George, you can also type it into the chat window if you like, and then we can share the slides after.
Yeah.
Sure. So I'll just exit presentation mode so that I can see the chat.
No problem. Good.
Yeah, and also the Teams channel that we've set up. We will add George, just in case you would want to have a conversation with him. We can get to organize for that. So we are here to support you guys. There you go. There's George's email in chat. Okay. Thank you guys for your time. This is a great session. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you guys. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.